Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Just waiting for folks to get into the Zoom room here. My name is Shawnee Harvey. I am the procurement manager for this RFP for EDD-ETA-2024. That is for the Energy Transition Act funding through the department. And I'm joined by Kayla Lucera Matusi, who is our Just Transition Advisor with EDD in the JEDI office. And we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, thanks for joining us. Today is March 5th, 2024, about 2:30, and we're going to be going through the pre-proposal webinar for RFP number EDD-ETA-2024. And let me go ahead and move us to our next slide. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here. So we're going to kind of do a broad overview of the ETA and of the RFP today. And if you do have questions, we're going to ask that you hold those till the end. I do see that someone has a hand raised right now. If it's something technical, potentially you can't hear us. If you can we also have a Q&A going, so I'll try and keep an eye on that as we move through this process. This webinar will be recorded. And again, we're going to go ahead and take questions likely at the end of this presentation. So we're going to go ahead and get started with a little broad overview of the ETA and then get into some more details of the RFP. Kayla, I would welcome you at this time. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Like Shawnee said, my name is Kayla Lucero Matusi, and I'm the Just Transition Advisor with EDD. So we're going to give you some broad information about this funding opportunity, and then we'll move to questions later. But to give some background, it's a long time coming. This is 2019 legislation, the Energy Transition Act, that has different provisions to facilitate or put into motion energy transition. So that includes rules for utilities and emissions reductions and things like that. It also provides direct assistance to displaced workers from fossil fuel facility closures. And there's also Economic Development Assistance Fund, or Energy Transition Economic Development Assistance Fund, which EDD is administering. And that's towards general goals like diversifying the New Mexico economy away from reliance on natural resource extraction and promoting economic development in communities that are affected by this transition. Great. So here's some information about eligibility, and our eligibility for this opportunity is pretty all-encompassing. So eligible entities include local governments, counties, schools, tribes, pueblos, nations, sole proprietors, LLCs, C Corps, and other business entities legally registered with the state of New Mexico. And here's a bit of information about the types of projects that we're looking for. So for example, any funding not covered by this opportunity, you would need to provide proof of that and show that you have those funds in addition to whatever you would receive through this opportunity if your application is successful to complete the project in a timely manner. We're also looking for projects that increase energy access across a range of possible communities, which would include low-income, rural, and underserved communities, tribes, pueblos, and nations, and communities impacted by these closures. In addition, anything that increases access for communities in the event of natural disasters or extreme weather, maybe locations like community centers or schools that could be congregating locations during those events would be a compelling case for funding through this opportunity. We also want proof of careful consideration for environmental impacts and the emissions reduction element of your proposal. And then finally, a robust community engagement plan. You're encouraged to submit detailed descriptions of that.
Thanks, Kayla. And I'd just like to add that for our desired projects, there's more of these listed in the RFP document itself. So you will hear us refer back to that RFP several times. This is a pretty shorthand list of what high-level requirements and requirements you're going to see within the RFP. So we've done our best to kind of summarize those here as to not overwhelm you all and then really encourage you to look back at that document.
Yep. And so the same goes for this list of expectations. You can find a more comprehensive list in the RFP document, and we really do encourage you to read it. You won't have a good application if you don't review all of the requirements and suggestions and guidelines in that document. So please do take a look. But some general expectations of the project include benefit to tribes, nations, and pueblos, rural communities, low-income communities. We're going to have really strong scoring available to projects that are able to show this. In addition, San Juan communities impacted by fossil fuel facility closures, prior expertise and experience in energy project development and implementation. And as you'll see in the RFP document, that includes a long-standing comprehension or experience with things like permitting and grid interconnection. So even if it's not the project applicant themselves, whatever subcontractors they might be working with should have a history of bringing projects like this to fruition. And then efforts to use New Mexico-based companies and contractors or subcontractors are definitely a plus. Technical feasibility, and that's just in terms of whatever technologies are being utilized, being able to prove that they're kind of already in use at scale within other, public sector or commercial applications. We're not looking for experimental technologies with this proposal. It's really things that are already tried and true. So, but also technical feasibility in terms of the applicant's ability to carry out the project in the time allotted. And then finally, in support of that aim, shovel readiness is a crucial part of any successful application through this opportunity.
Thank you, Kayla. And again, these are part of the mandatory specifications or portions of the RFP that we will be looking at in terms of scoring. This is a shortened list, and there's also some expectations around organizational references and organizational experience, and that is also detailed in the RFP document. So I'll go ahead and move us forward to what kind of funding is available through this RFP. This RFP there is a typo on the screen. I'm missing a zero. That should say 5.9 million. My apologies that I am missing a zero there, but there's $5.9 million in funding available for this program. And our expectations is that the funding for this RFP is going to be made available before June 30th, 2024, which is the end of this coming fiscal year. And the way that we see these RFP awards or proposals being awarded is through either a contract or IGA, which is an intergovernmental agreement. But this is going to be depending on the applying organizations or offerers entity. So if we are receiving applications from tribes and pueblos or qualified New Mexico universities that receive funding from the state, they would likely see the project final agreement structured as an IGA, whereas for larger companies, due to the New Mexico Gift Act and other legislation, that will be done on a contract basis, which would look like a reimbursement basis, as opposed to an IGA, which would be done a little bit differently depending on that applying entity. So I'll move us forward again. And this is some of our important dates that we would like you all to look at. There is a sequence of events in the larger RFP where you can kind of find the timeline for what we're looking at. It is a shortened timeline because we are up against reversion dates for the funding, as well as kind of internal state contract deadlines and agreement deadlines on when we're able to enter into those. So acknowledgements of receipt, which would place you on the distribution list to receive questions. There is a form in the RFP and kind of a summary of what it takes to complete that form. It's also included in the appendices. That will need to be signed and returned by March 8th at the deadline. I believe that the deadline for most of these are 5 p.m. Mountain. And then the deadline to submit questions is also going to be March 8th. So we're sitting at March 5th right now. So that gives folks the opportunity to kind of rewatch this webinar since it will be recorded, and then submit those acknowledgements of receipts and questions by the end of March 8th. We are projecting March 13th as the response to written questions. Again, if you do have questions about this RFP, because it's going through a state procurement process, I can't really take phone calls on it. Most questions have to be submitted in writing, following a subject line for the email, all of which those details are included in the RFP document itself, which is available on our website and on our public notices page. And we have the submission of proposals are due March 22nd. So those are kind of the high level dates that folks really need to focus on as we're moving through this process. And we have a rather short presentation for you here, but again, proposals are going to be due March 22nd, 2024 via email to myself as the procurement manager for this RFP. It should be emailed to me in one document. Again, you will find the details of how that proposal needs to be structured in the RFP, and you can find it on our website at edd.newmexico.gov/public-notices. And that's really where you can get into the details of the full document. But again, I'll kind of take us back to eligible entities. Again, it's very broad. We've designed this in a way that we want to make sure projects that are eligible have an opportunity to apply. But we also want to encourage you to really get in and look at those high level requirements and mandatory specifications set out by the RFP. So there is kind of an expectation around what the project's end goals will be doing. There's some expectations around job creation and communities served. So again, that kind of ties to benefit to San Juan communities that are affected by closure of fossil fuel facilities. So that includes communities in those surrounding areas. And there's kind of a focus around tribes and pueblos in that area. So I'm going to take us back to our questions slide, and I am going to address a couple of questions that I've had come up since we've sent the notice out for this RFP. And again, we do understand that this is, 2019 legislation. This has been 5 years in the making. So we're familiar that several of the submitting entities and projects have kind of been on notice, waiting for when this would go live. We are aware that it is a shortened timeline. So for those who have submitted previous applications, requests, RFIs, or requests for interests to the original ETA Council, what we would do is suggest pulling out those RFIs, dusting them off, and then making the correct modifications for them to fit this RFP expectation. I will address the questions that I see popping up here, but I did want to address a couple of things that I had come up. I've had some questions around smaller LLCs or sole proprietorships applying for this funding. Again, LLCs and sole, maybe not, yes, registered entities with the state. If you're registered to be conducting business legally with the state, you will be eligible to apply. However, I would just bring the attention back to what those mandatory specifications are. Again, this is a shortened and condensed list. I think that it goes A through M of the alphabet on the different mandatory specifications within the RFP, but we will be looking at the benefit to San Juan County communities and impacted by those closures. So if you are going to apply and you are an LLC or small business, some sort of corporation, we would want you to look back at those mandatory specifications to see if where your business might be positioned in the state makes sense for you to apply. So that's kind of answering the question that I've gotten on the smaller entities having the opportunity and whether or not they should apply. Some of the questions I've got around energy efficiency and so on. Yes, it fits into like the general program parameters, but I would really stress for people to look at that mandatory specification and high level requirements breakdowns within the RFP to get familiar if it's really going to be a good fit. I've also had some questions about other county areas. Again, part of our scoring will be tied directly to the bullets that you see on the screen, which are technical feasibility and benefits to tribes, nations, and pueblos, low-income and rural communities, as well as San Juan County, because the way that the original legislation was written, it did directly address closures in the San Juan County area. So what I'll do is I'll take us back to our question. I'll take us back to our questions. When and where will the webinar recording be available? The recording will be made available as soon as we wrap the presentation and wait for Zoom to kind of finish uploading the recording and it's made available to us through the cloud. Then we will be able to make those shifts. So I'm going to go ahead and mark that one answered live. The next one that I see from our anonymous attendees is that this seems to have little interest or little similarity. Unfortunately, that's not a question, so I'm not going to address it at this time. Another one, over a period of years, ETA Commission reviewed project proposals and made recommendations for funding. Will there be any ETA funds remaining for those recommendations? The recommendations that were made by the council, our leadership and our agency has made it a point to make sure that those projects were reached out to make sure they have the information for this RFP so that they're able to apply. So we have reached out to those original RFI submissions and submitted and recommended projects from the ETA Commission. So we are doing our best to include those recommendations in here. Unfortunately, because of state procurement process, the recommendations that were made by the council or commission, because the amounts being so high, the Department of Finance and Administration asked and made it kind of mandatory that we go out to RFP for these funds because the funding is such a large amount. So we are tied to state regulatory procurement guidelines and those guidelines that are written throughout the RFP. San Juan County mentioned as an impacted community. What about Cibola County communities that were impacted by the closure of the Escalante power plant that was also a fossil fuel facility? So what I'm going to try and do right now is check the existing Energy Transition Act that was passed in the final document, and Escalante is not mentioned within that document from the search that I'm performing right now. So again, we did structure this RFP based on guidance from our leadership in this agency, as well as what's deliberately named within the legislation, which is Senate Bill 489. So I will go ahead and do another check here, but from what I can tell, Escalante is not mentioned directly in that SB 489. And this has been tailored directly to the legislation and the requirements of the Economic Development Department in this legislation, which broadly defines the fund as one that is to assist in diversifying and promoting the affected community's economy by fostering economic development opportunities unrelated to fossil fuel development or use. And previously in that legislation defines the affected communities as those affected by the San Juan generation closures, from my understanding. Kayla, if you have anything you'd like to add on that.
I will just say, to my knowledge, there is not a strict definition of affected communities in the ETA, and I've searched the document for that language. So if you think you have a compelling application from an area that's impacted by some sort of closure, then definitely don't count yourself out. I think our agency's understanding has generally been that this opportunity would primarily focus on the San Juan region, but yeah, any community affected by fossil fuel facility closures should consider applying, or any entity.
Thank you, Kayla. And again, for some of that scoring, again, I would take a look at the mandatory specification. There is a piece that is focused on San Juan County. It is not the overarching requirement of the RFP. Again, it is a piece of scoring that we will be taking into consideration. Next question that I have, or let me jump down to the question about when the recording will be available. After we end this recording, it has to be like downloaded and configured by Zoom or my computer. Once that recording is made available to me, I have to get into YouTube and upload it, which might take a little bit of time. And then once we have that link live and ready to go, we will post it on the public notices page and along with the RFP information to make this recording available. We can send an email notification. We will send an email notification probably to the general subscriber list to let them know that that recording is available. Can you comment on the, this is the next question, excuse me. Can you comment on the difference between the original ETA RFI intent / focus on new industries and jobs versus the RFP, which seems to be community centric? I can't speak directly to the original RFI that was put out by Department of Workforce Solutions in conjunction with the ETAC. I was not deeply involved in that process. This RFP done through EDD has been designed at the guidance of leadership in line with the legislation and requirements for funding. And that's kind of how this was designed. Kayla, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
I was actually looking at Joseph's comment in the chat, and thanks for that. It says ETA funds are only available for impacted communities within a 100-mile radius from San Juan Generating Station. I had consulted our general counsel on this, but I can go back to her and clarify. So we'll make sure to get an answer to that for you. Thanks.
Thank you, Kayla. Would you also be able to elaborate a little more on what shovel-ready means? I can speak to this a little bit. Shovel-ready projects, this is pretty typical for EDD projects and incentives. In order for us to award funding for projects and for any kind of development, shovel-ready really means that permitting and regulations are in order, that subcontractors might have already been identified, that the project has kind of already gone through a feasibility study and environmental impacts. Shovel ready also would mean that pending getting awarded funding for this, you would have all the funding necessary to complete the project from start to finish. I've described this also as like if you have for example, a $10 million project, but only $8 million to date, and you apply for $2 million in funding, then on the application, you would need to demonstrate that that $2 million, if awarded, would show that the project is ready to be completed from start to finish. So shovel ready is a pretty typical economic development term, as well as kind of what they sometimes look for in other legislative funding. They want to know that the projects are kind of ready to hit the ground, ready to break ground, and ready to go. Kayla, do you have anything to add on shovel readiness?
Yeah, I would say that on the energy development front, I think Shawnee had alluded to this, but that also means a few things that are mentioned in the RFP document, such as easements, permitting, grid interconnection, and then a subcontractor, if that's the entity that will be actually doing construction for the project, that has prior experience with all of that and is ready to proceed on an appropriate timeline. So it's basically being ready to break ground in all those different senses of the term.
Thank you, Kayla. I have a question here on how many awards will be issued. We don't have an idea of how many awards will be issued. It will be based on the number of responses that we get and the funding that is available for the full program. Again, that's a total of 5.9 million, and projects are going to be evaluated on a multitude of different factors. And then the resulting awards could be more than one, or it could be one. It's just going to kind of depend on the projects that come in and how the scoring ends up looking. For the ETA funds only available within a 100-mile radius. I guess we were going to get clarification on that one, so we may be able to address that in those who send that acknowledgement of receipt form in. We'll be able to address that there. Next question I see is there any consideration or mention of Rio Arriba County in the legislation? From what I can see off the bat, no, not directly. And again, I would just go back to those mandatory specifications that really look at heavily what the project is looking to achieve and whether or not it has those components of shovel readiness, permitting, regulatory, etc. But from the bill that I have open, the final version of SB 489, there is no mention of Rio Arriba County. What I will also do right now is I'm putting the link to our website into the chat. And if you go to the bottom of our public notices page, you will see the Energy Transition Act RFP information. So that can be found on the bottom of that page there. Answered this. Let me see. I have another question here that says, I won't have my adult son's contributions. Will that be a problem? I don't understand the context of that question. So if there's another way to maybe word that, or if someone wants to raise their hand and come off mute to re-ask that question, I'm not sure how to ask that. If it's in there is a part of the RFP, there is a requirement to fill out a campaign contributions form. That is just a mandatory part of the RFP. It's a form that has to be signed. I don't know if that question is directly tied to that, but yes, RJ, if you'd like to speak to that question.
Yes, that's exactly what the question is.
Okay.
I won't have my adult son's contribution, so I have no idea if they're contributing.
Okay. Typically I would say if you would want to look at when you're filling out the RFP, for whoever the main people involved on that RFP are, there's going to be an ask of campaign contributions. So you may have to work with them to get that information in order to submit that form before you finalize. Let me see what I can do real quickly here. What I'll do is this is the campaign contribution form. It's going to be a little hard to look at just because of the size of my screen. This is the Appendix B, and this form must be included and must be filled out by any prospective contractor, whether or not their family member, or their representative, like that's filling out the application, has made any contributions subject to disclosure. So there is an amount here that they have to disclose if anything is over this amount in a 2-year period. And again, it defines campaign contributions, it defines family members, and then it asks for this information. And this is deliberately connected to Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham's ability there. So I think that for your question, RJ, like yes, you would likely have to get that information before you're able to fully submit. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
All right, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and mute, and then I'm going to go back to sharing our little question slide. Thank you for your patience, everyone. Answered live. Let's see. The updates during the 2023 session to ETA funding, I thought only applied to Workforce Solutions money, not EDD. For the 2023 session, I would have to know exactly which updates you were talking about. For example, other agencies, I believe IAD and potentially some other agencies may have had changes around dates for this funding or uses. As far as I know, EDD is still tied to, EDD is still tied to deadlines for this funding, where the funding will revert June 30th, 2024, which is at the end of this fiscal year. And let's see, the webinar is being recorded. And let me see here. Sorry, trying to keep track of everyone's questions. Is a nonprofit organization considered an eligible entity? Kayla, can you speak to that? Is that deliberately named in the legislation?
I don't know if that's named in the legislation, but it seems like it's not named in the eligible entities for the RFP.
Yeah, what I'll do is get some clarification on that. So yeah, you know what? Let me see if I can address this one quickly. Oops, I'm in the RFP and not the legislation. Let me pull the legislation here, folks. 1 second. So nonprofits aren't directly mentioned in the RFP. So according to our eligible entities, as it's stated here, we're looking at local governments, counties, schools, which would be like universities and kind of state-funded schools, or maybe colleges and universities across the board, tribes, pueblos, nations, sole proprietors, LLCs, and other businesses registered directly with the state. But how we have the RFP worded right now, it does not look like nonprofits are going to be eligible to apply, but we can seek clarification on that. Again, if it's something that you would like to submit as a written question along with an acknowledgement of receipt, we can make sure that that goes out. Next question I see here is, when do the funds have to be spent if awarded? So I think the desire is there's an expectation that maybe like June 2025 projects would be completed and that funds would be spent, but we have to have these funds out the door by June 30th, 2024. So again, that's going to look different depending on the awarded entity. If they are IGA eligible, we would do it as an intergovernmental agreement. And if they are not IGA eligible, which they are not a county, tribe, or qualified college or university that receives state funding, we're going to be looking at doing them on a contract basis, which would be on a reimbursement basis, where IGAs would be done on a little bit of a different basis. So I hope that that answers the question. I think the desire is to have the money funded and awarded to projects before June 30th, 2024, and that projects would hope to be completed within a reasonable timeline. Right now, that's looking like June 2025. But again, I think that the high level requirements for the RFP as well as the mandatory specs do ask for a timeline. So that'll also be part of the consideration. And let me see. If we serve low-income communities, but not in San Juan, not rural, not tribal, are we still eligible? So to that question, again, it is all going to be tied to the scoring. So I would definitely recommend to look into the mandatory specifications and the scoring breakdown that's included in the RFP, and that can really show you where your project would fall in this scoring category. Let's see. Can a project that meets all the specs and already 50% funded by USDA REAP grant also seek further funding through this program? So again, one of the requirements on desired projects is that the funding, if awarded by this program, would be able to account for that full other 50% of the funding. So to answer that again, if it's a 50%, so if it's a $1 million project and $500,000 is secured and there's a $500,000 gap, if you can demonstrate in your application that that $500,000, if awarded, would complete the project in full, then yes, it is an eligible, it would be eligible to apply for the program. I hope that that makes sense.
And I'll just add a caveat to that. Thank you, Joseph and others for pointing out that language. So I'm just reading here in the ETA, and my apologies, I genuinely missed this. It says, affected community means a New Mexico county located within 100 miles of a New Mexico facility producing electricity that closes, resulting in at least 40 displaced workers. And there's a corresponding definition for that. So yeah, and I think that corresponds with conversations that we've had internally about how sort of we have a broad understanding of affected communities, and we are looking at different closures that have taken place in the state. But at the same time, I think there's been a general focus on the San Juan region. So don't count yourself out if you're from somewhere else. And like Shawnee was saying, with the mandatory specifications, each one of those are worth points. So entities that apply and can check all of those boxes will get more points, but it's not technically required that you have all of them. You just won't score as highly.
Thank you, Kayla. I have another question here. How many points should we have to apply 1534 available? So let me look at the scoring breakdown briefly. So there is an evaluation point summary in the RFP, and there is a total points in this RFP of 1,300 total points available. That is not including the Native American resident preference or New Mexico resident preference. It also does not include the possibility of the New Mexico / Native American resident veteran preference. So there is some additional points available for New Mexico or Native American residents that have that paperwork. There is a form through Tax and Revenue Department for that certification. You can only claim one or the other. It's either a resident preference or a resident veteran preference. So your the applications would also be eligible for those points if that criteria is included. And again, that is a total of 1,300 points, not including those preferences. And you have a combination of 850 points available in technical specifications, which includes your organizational experience, mandatory specification, and organizational references. And then you have business specification points for a total of 450 points. And that is through cost points and oral presentation points, not including the resident potential points as well. Let's see here. I do think it should be recognized that these funds come from refinancing of outstanding debt in the San Juan Generating Station by PNM, so funding should benefit that community specifically. Yes, so again, there is details in this RFP around how things will be scored, but we will also still be tied statutorily to the legislation. So if the legislation points out some of those facts around a 100-mile radius, I think that even though it might not directly be named, even though it's reflected in the way we will be scoring these RFPs, we will still be tied to the statutory legislative requirements set out in SB 489. Okay, so the cost category, if you can look at the RFP, that's why we encourage folks to go ahead and look at that document and get really familiar with it. It is a long document, but it is worth being very familiar with the requirements. After the cost breakdown, there's evaluation factors, and it goes into detail about how everything is scored, how many points it takes to score, as well as a cost calculation that is standard from General Services Division or Department for GSD as part of New Mexico procurement. So in the RFP, you can find the detailed cost breakdown of how we have to do that calculation. Right now, from what we see, so this is interesting, Kayla. I would say for this question around 501c3s and private schools, we did say that schools are eligible entities, but we did not directly name nonprofits as part of that eligibility criteria. That is something that I will, that we will have to clarify with our legal counsel and whether or not that eligibility would stand. Okay, let me see. Charlie.
Hey, hi, Shani. Can you hear me? This is Charlie.
Yes.
Great. Yeah, thank you for taking my question. I see that the cost is the highest point score item in the evaluation. But I'm just curious, how is that category evaluated? Is a higher cost or lower overall cost better, or is it the value, say, cost per kilowatt hour of generation, or is it how we present the information? So if you could just expand a little bit about what goes into that cost evaluation, that'd be great.
Sure. Thank you for the question, Charlie. And what I'd like to kind of bring attention to is the technical specifications are actually worth a total of 850 points. So cost is not the most heavily weighted piece of this RFP. It looks like that in the breakdown only because mandatory specification has been broken out into several different particulars. So the mandatory specification is actually worth a total of 650 points, not including the organizational references and organizational experience, which are other two separate sections that are both worth 100 points. So mandatory specification is going to be weighted more heavily in this process. And in terms of cost, there is a formula that is noted in the RFP that is used to determine how the cost points will be awarded. And that is standard for RFP from General Services Department, GSD. So that's calculated by doing a calculation between the variety of costs that are submitted on proposals times the number of available award points. So it's a math calculation, and it would just be followed under how we are looking like that, how we are looking at it.
I would also note quickly that another important component of our evaluation is your description of how you obtained both labor and equipment in a cost competitive manner. And that's just to ensure that it's not per se one of the scoring items, but we are very interested in seeing proposals that can demonstrate this.
Sure, but Kayla, what I'd like to say to that as well is the way that the RFP works is the cost proposal is a separate proposal than the technical specifications and feasibility. So it does have to be submitted separately, and that is detailed in the RFP.
Yeah, we're interested in both pieces of information, and we will evaluate them separately.
And then I've got one here that says, are there point considerations for the efforts of 2 previous RFI submittals and the many cycles leading to this point in time? That I would speak to definitely the organizational experience and the organizational references. Those pieces of the cost, if you can refer back to that kind of stuff, we will be taking that into consideration when it comes to scoring. And I believe that there's also some part of the mandatory specification that looks for prior experience and expertise in energy project development and implementation. That will also kind of be used to address that. So it should definitely be built into the application under those considerations. And then this last question around the evaluation table that says that our evaluation summary notes 100 points for oral presentations in the scoring table, and then under the factors shows a value of 150 points. That would be a typo on my end because I have been running 2 RFPs, and the score will match what we've written in the evaluation point summary table. So the table itself that we did finalize and go over is the final number of points that will be awarded. So in that table, it does say that oral presentations are 100 points. That is what we will be sticking to. So that is what I can say for that. So that is my mistake, because there's so many things that have to change when you change an RFP down to the very appendices and the very notices. So I did miss that, and it is still a value of 100 points. I just missed that one. So I apologize for that. That will still tie to it. Charlie, did you have another question, or was your hand still just raised?
I think I raised my hand by accident, but thank you for answering my questions. I appreciate it.
Thank you all. We know that this has been a long time coming, waiting for the department to kind of release this funding. We understand that it is on a crunched timeline. We have done our best to design the scoring template and table to take into account the needs of the legislation, the requirements around communities affected by San Juan generating closures, as well as acknowledging that people have worked on previous RFIs to submit for consideration for this funding. So we have tried our best to build all of that into the scoring metrics and into the evaluation table for how we will be scoring this RFP. And again, these are kind of the dates. So I believe that that is Friday. The 8th is Friday at 5 p.m. that acknowledgements of receipt and deadline to submit questions will be. And then we'll be working diligently to get you formalized formal responses by March 13th. Again, response to written questions, after you look through the RFP, we are only able to respond in a formal document if we have that acknowledgement of receipt. So if you ask me a question, usually I do not do this. If you ask me a written question by the deadline, but you haven't submitted an acknowledgement of receipt, you will get an answer to your question, but you will not get responses to everyone else's questions without that acknowledgement of receipt. Usually I do not say that because I stress people to please read the RFP, because that's why we've tried to diligently put all of that information in there for you. I know it is a dense government document, and there is a lot of appendices and in kind of legal jargon and regular general contract language, but there's a lot of information on the background and overview, high-level requirements, and mandatory specifications that will help you design a proposal or refresh your proposal to fit within those guidelines. At this time, I'm not seeing any more questions. If anyone else has any outstanding questions, I will give a brief moment to entertain those at this time. And Kayla, I just want to say thank you for helping through this and answer questions about this RFP, and appreciate you helping me present this information. I'm seeing no other hands and no other, there was a question on how many people attended. I think at the high point, there's about 48 people total in the room. But that's only for the folks that were able to make it today. So thank you all for your time. We look forward to receiving your acknowledgements of receipt and your written questions. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and end us here, and then we will get this uploaded to our YouTube page and get an email out with a notice of the recording as soon as possible.
I've got one quick note. So the 3 outstanding questions that I heard were with regards to the eligibility of nonprofits, and secondly, private schools. And then there was the question around affected communities, and thanks to those who brought that language to my attention. So what I'm going to do, we can stop recording in a second, but I'm going to drop my email in the chat. And if you were one of the people who wanted an answer to those,
yeah, so any questions about the RFP have to go directly to me as the procurement manager. So if you do have questions, my email is up on the screen. That's just standard procurement process.
Okay.
We'll still be working with Miss Lucera Matusi to get those answers for you all. But just to follow the procurement process, they do have to come to me.
So if you ask those, thanks, Shawnee. If you ask those via Shawnee, we can make sure that we have answers to those, and we've noted those 3 questions on our end.
Perfect. Thank you, Kayla. I appreciate it. And thank you all for your time today.